So welcome to a very interesting session looking at the microbiome. Is it the solution to our problems? So I guess from today's panel discussion, we hope to give you a deep and meaningful insights in terms of what the microbiome can do. And we've got a great panelists that can discuss those issues, and I'd like to introduce them to you right now. So welcome, panelists. So what I'll just do is just briefly introduce the panelists, and I'll just give them a brief introduction, and they'll describe what they do in the space of the microbiome, and then we'll have some one-on-one questions, and then later towards the end we'll open it up to the audience for any Q&A that you might have for the panelists. So first of all, in the far side is John Ridley. He's the managing director for Converte. Welcome. We also have Fiona Soulsby from ProAgni. She's the co-founder and the chief financial officer. Welcome.
Thank you.
And closest to me is Michael Conlon. So he's a senior research scientist at CSIRO. So my first question is maybe you guys can just give the audience in terms of a brief description of what you do and what area of the microbiome that you work in. So we might start with you first.
Okay, good morning everyone. My name's John Ridley. I work for a company called Converte. We make a whole series of products for agriculture, for feeding the soil microbiome and the plant microbiome. We started doing this in 2011, so we've been working directly with farmers now for about 8 years. In the last 3 years, we've actually had a university partnership where we can start looking into the soil and looking what's happening at a DNA level. So when you start feeding the microbiome, you see a lot of changes. It's probably one of the most exciting things that's happening in agriculture is just seeing that change in terms of the change in the soil structure, water retention, the way nutrients start to cycle and become plant available when you treat them in the right way. So we've been doing this for 8 years, and it's really scalable, and it can make a difference to a lot of major issues like climate change, like food health. So we're very excited to be part of the whole microbiome space.
Hi, my name is Fiona Soulsby. I'm a co-founder of ProAgni. ProAgni started about 5 years ago. Our focus is in the animal nutrition space and optimising the feed and resources that are utilised in intensive animal production, and making those resources work a lot better. We have 3 key areas, and it is about feed efficiency and productivity and performance. We're also focused on eliminating the use of antibiotics in intensive production. And our third core focus is reducing our emissions and our carbon footprint from intensive animal production. Our specialist area is really in ruminants, so in cattle and sheep. And our focus is really on the microbiome, so it's on gut health, it's on the fermentation of the rumen, and how we can adjust our feed substrates to optimise that fermentation process to create energy and byproducts that the animal can use to either convert to meat, milk, wool, whatever the productive potential is. The rumen health is also so important for productivity, for reproduction, for lactation, and it's also part of a unique and integrated system, which goes through to soils. The microbe population, it's not just in guts, it's on skin, it's in nasal passages, it's in the soil, in the water. So our company is about creating safe feeds that actually provide economic and environmental performance, and really it underpins the sustainable development goals that we're all here learning about over these past few days.
I'm Michael Conlon. I'm a senior research scientist at CSIRO in Adelaide. I've been working in the area of diet and lifestyle and how that impacts gut microbiota and health. we've been interested in developing new foods and looking at existing foods and how they can influence disease, in particular looking at dietary fibres like resistant starch, and then trying to understand which microbes are key in, I guess, firstly, mediating those effects of diet, firstly on gut health, but now as we're beginning to understand the role of gut microbes, how that actually also influences the health of the rest of the body, whether it's through the gut-brain axis, the gut-skin axis, or through the liver. Potentially all tissues of the body have some link to what goes on in the gut, and also influenced by diet. So I've applied this knowledge to all sorts of areas, developing new foods, new probiotics and new prebiotics, also trying to understand what are the causes and also preventative treatments for things like colorectal cancer, inflammatory bowel disease, and even autism. So yes, quite a broad area of expertise.
Thanks, guys. So you can see there's a very broad range of microbiota space that we can work on. But I'm assuming that most of you know what microbiota is, but I'm assuming that we should have that definition first before, what is the microbiota or the microbiome? Is it good or is it bad? Well, there's a general perception that, when we talk about microbiome or bacteria, everybody thinks it's bad. So can you guys clarify that in a way? Michael, you can go.
I can start off. Yeah, I think definitely in recent sort of campaigns and my discussions with the general public, I think most people sort of see bacteria, or initially people saw bacteria as a bad thing, but I think now when we see various products on the shelf, we assume that most of the microbes that we're consuming are good for us. One of the key problems that we have is actually defining what actually is a healthy gut and what is a healthy microbiome or profile. The answer is we don't know all of that yet, but certainly some microbes under some certain circumstances can be both beneficial and also pathogenic. And I can give an example, say for example of E. coli. Many might understand that there have been outbreaks of problems, people eating spoilt goods where actually people die from certain strains of E. coli, and yet we can also buy E. coli as a probiotic. It can actually function to actually inhibit the growth of some of the pathogenic microbes, and so any one type of microbe on any given day or a circumstance could actually act as both either a good or a bad microbe depending on the circumstances. But another key point I think to understand in terms of what is a microbe, I mean it's a microorganism, and there are all sorts of microorganisms, so it's not just bacteria. We're talking about yeasts, we're talking about algae, we can actually be talking about tiny animals called helminths, types of worms, and don't forget viruses. So actually most of the microorganisms in your gut are actually viruses, and in fact we were just talking about this the other day. They've discovered that just one type of a virus called a bacteriophage, which infects bacteria, is the most dominant microbe in the gut. It represents about 50% of all the microbes. So there's a lot yet to learn, and what the influences are on all of those is a real area for growth.
Fiona, we want to speculate on the livestock, the animal microbes, and what are they good, they're bad, or how do we change that balance?
Yeah. So again, in livestock, it's not indifferent to the human space. We actually share a lot of microbial species between humans and animals. I guess the important thing is to have balance. So we actually need good and bad. They create byproducts and waste products that they are the bacteria or the yeast, viruses use within the body, and that creates different energy for different parts of the system. Talking in the ruminant space, like the rumen is a large kind of fermentation vat full of all of these different microorganisms. In 1 ml of the fluid within the rumen, there's potentially 100 billion microbes, so a substantial lot, and hundreds of different species. There's a lot of research that has been done in this space, and there's a lot of beneficial microbes, I guess, that we now know about, but there is still so much work yet to be done. The other interesting thing about bacteria in particular is it can adjust and modify itself really rapidly. So then we start to see new bacterial species as well through selective pressure.
Yeah, it's very. Bacteria is so clever; they can swap their genes around and things like that. Much cleverer than we are, I think. But if you look at the big picture, of species on the planet is absolutely dominated by bacteria. You know, and every single system is dominated by bacteria, and we have more bacteria in us than we have human cells, and we have way more bacterial genes in our bodies than we have human genes. So bacteria is so significant. I think in agriculture, it is about balance. You know, you can get negative reactions with bacteria and fungal infections in soil, but it comes down to balance. And if you do the right things by the soil, you tend to balance out the different bacterial and fungal groups and produce a positive health effect in the soil. So I think it's important to remember that the bacteria are all there in agriculture. So any farming system you go to, there's a population of microbes and fungi there, but they're being suppressed by the heavy industrial chemical load that we're putting into agriculture. So if you go to a piece of land that's never been farmed, and you can pick up the soil, you put it through a DNA machine. This is why things are changing so rapidly, because the DNA testing now is so cheap and accessible that you can actually do it for soil sampling, which 5 years ago was ridiculously expensive to do that, but now it's affordable. And you can see what's living in the soil. And if you do that in virgin land that's never been touched, you've got a very, very vibrant, healthy microbiome. But if you go to a broadacre cropping site that's been hit with a range of pesticides and herbicides, then your microbiome's suppressed. It's still there, can be brought back to life, but it's suppressed.
You just can touch in that space of the soil. You know, Australia is a very harsh environment and it's hard to grow crops. So what practices are we doing at the moment in agriculture to increase the soil microbe diversity? Can you mention that, if there's anything that we're doing?
Yeah, look, there's some really good things happening out there in agriculture. So a lot of agriculture now is no-till. So they're not ploughing the land like they used to. When you turn over the land, you're losing carbon, and you'll lose the microbial population to some extent if you plough. There's lots of different types of cover cropping. So if you're keeping growing plants all year round, you're feeding microbes. So the growing plant will secrete what's called root exudates, and they will be feeding the microbes. So the plants, in many ways, the plants dictate the microbial community. So there's a lot going on signaling between plants and microbes that we don't fully understand. But if a plant wants a certain element for its growth, like it wants some zinc or moly, it'll be telling the microbes, go find those elements for me. And the more diverse your farming system is in terms of different plant species, the more diverse your soil microbiome will be. And on top of that, it's more resilient. So in terms of climate stresses, if you've got a mixed system, it's much more resilient.
Just to continue on with that as well, so we know some of the farming practices have a lot of fertilizers, nitrogen, phosphorus, and that has an effect on the environment as well. So the effect of bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef. Is there ways we can change that farming practices and improve our environment and sustainability? Can you comment on that? Yeah,
sure. So what we do is we made complex plant foods that will feed all aspects of the soil food web. So the entire living space in the soil, we're feeding that system. And the first thing we see with our trial work is that the structure of the soil will change. So if you fire up the microbiome, you've got so much more life there. Bacteria grow and die very, very quickly. They leave behind their skins and they start creating pore spaces in the soil. So the first thing you will notice by doing the right thing by the soil microbiome is the soil structure will start to change. And you can actually find it by walking across a farmer's field. You'll find where you've changed the soil structure just by walking on it. And that soil, as a consequence, will start to store more moisture. So it's critical. We're losing so much water because the soil can't cope. The soil's compacted. On a lot of conventionally farmed paddocks, the soil's too compacted to hold that moisture. So we're losing it through evaporation and runoff. So that's the first thing you see. And it's very easy to measure with a simple penetrometer. You can measure with a pressure gauge. You can measure how compact is your soil. And once the soil started opening up, it starts to function and the bacteria start to make nutrients plant available. Like the nitrogen that's applied globally is, I'll be cautious and say it's 50% efficient. That means 50% of the nitrogen we apply ends up in the ocean and causes problems of eutrophication in river systems and in the ocean. And the phosphorus is very similar. The phosphorus gets locked up in the soil because it needs to be converted biologically so it's available for the plant. So if you're not looking after your microbiome, you're also storing a lot of phosphorus in the soil and you're just building up a bank of phosphorus. So it's probably as much as 80% of phosphorus supply just goes into lockup if you're not treating your soils properly. And then next year, your agronomist will tell you need more phosphorus. So you go and put more phosphorus on, and you're just building it up. But if you actually measure the total pool of phosphorus in the soil, not just what's plant available in the soil, there's a huge bank of phosphorus sitting across Australia under agricultural land. Huge amounts of phosphorus. Just needs biology to mobilize it. So we've got a massive opportunity to reduce fertilizer inputs across just nitrogen and phosphorus. Many other benefits, but just look at those core macronutrients, huge potential.
Right.
And if we can stop it running into the barrier reef, that's great, isn't it?
Yeah. Fiona, so we heard John talk about trying to make the soil better. So what are we doing in terms of making the microbes in the livestock more beneficial in terms that would increase production? So would we like to comment on those strategies?
Yeah, so we have challenges in animal production right now, and that's to do with our overuse of antibiotics in intensive production. So that's grain-based feeding systems. And also our carbon footprint. So we're getting a lot of pressure from the methane emissions from livestock in particular. Both those components are to do with diet, digestion, and in focusing on digestion and optimising digestion, so utilising those microbes to our benefit, we can actually help resolve some of those issues that we face as an industry. Our particular focus is in getting the right microbial populations in the rumen to, in particular, ferment grain without the use of antibiotic inclusions, because we know that over 70% of antibiotic use globally is done in intensive animal production, and we also know that up to 80% of that just comes out the back end of an animal and into the environment. So that's into our soils, into our waterways, which is then affecting the biodiversity within the soils and waterways. So we're all part of this, integrated system. We don't believe that there's a silver bullet and one thing will fix all things. But our focus is really on how can we alter diets to ensure we don't impact feed efficiency. So we're still really using those resources well. So that's grain and water and grass. Yet getting an output in animal production that we're seeking, which is meat, milk, wool. And we're learning that there's particular species of bacteria that metabolise the different feed substrates. And we can actually modify diets to help adjust animals to transition to particular diets a lot faster while maintaining their health and immunity and increasing their actual performance and productivity. It's really exciting. We've got into industrialised ag, unfortunately in a way in animal production, and now we have to step back and have a big awareness really of the microbiome and how that can impact our production systems to provide the resilience that we need in agriculture and that sustainability that we're all looking forward to.
So just to talk about the novel feeds that you're feeding to these animals. So a lot of the cattle produce a lot of the gas called methane, which is quite detrimental to the environment. So are you combating that with the feed strategies?
Yeah, so there's particular bacterial species within the rumen called methanogens, and they're responsible for the methane production. The rumen actually needs methanogens. They're part of the unique system that creates energy and byproduct for other bacteria. what happens is we end up with an imbalance. So we're getting too much methane production. And methane out the front end of an animal, and we have nitrous oxide out the back end, they are essentially waste products. So it's inefficient use of the resources that the animal has consumed. So really it's understanding how we can adapt to get the right quantities of, the microbe populations, so we're not wasting those, natural resources.
Okay. Let's move on to you, Michael. So I'm very in tune with the gut health space in humans, and we're doing a lot of stuff in terms of dietary changes, lifestyle changes to improve the microbial diversity of humans. So can you talk a bit about that and what things are we doing at the moment that's going to improve that?
So I think the key word you used there was diversity, and I think, I guess there's a couple of, challenges that we're facing. So firstly, to explain, in humans, we're all different in terms of our gut microbiota. So from birth, we start to have that distinct gut microbiota profile, and that's partly coming from the environment, partly coming from our parents and other interactions. There's a rough estimates are that we've got at least several hundred different types of microbes or species of microbes in each of our guts. And as I said, they vary from individual to individual. So over the last decade, there's been a lot of effort put into trying to understand what are the microbes in our own guts, in the human population. But also, another step further is if we can actually identify them, what do they actually do? So a real challenge that we have at the moment is just trying to understand what actual microbes are present in all of our intestinal systems, but also to really understand, well, what do they contribute in terms of our health? There's a real challenge still to be had there. And I think that also leads to, why do we want to know that? So we do know that diversity of those microbes is really important to our health. So you might have certain microbes can carry out similar functions to others. And so we do understand that there's a bit of redundancy there. So one individual may not have a particular type of microbe, but they may have another, but they can carry out the same function. What we find is that with disease, that you often see a significant reduction in the diversity of the microbes present. And so particularly we see that as we age. As you get older, there's a tendency to lose that diversity now, and there are a number of reasons for that. There is genetics, programming, but it also can come down to your diet and your lifestyle. There are a number of studies now showing that if you can have regimes that can maintain a strong diversity of the gut microbiota in your intestines, that you actually have better health outcomes than those who don't. We certainly see that in certain conditions like inflammatory bowel disease, a real telltale sign is a real reduction in the range of microbes that are present. And so firstly understanding what do we do to stop that decrease in diversity, but then what treatments have we got? And so traditionally using things like probiotics and prebiotics has been the go-to, treatment. But I think we're still not really understanding what we need to do in that space. So most of the probiotics, for example, are based on a couple of key microbe genera, so the lactobacillus and the bifidobacterium. I mean, there are other species that are used, but by and large, they're the ones that are being used by most of the companies. And the reality is they only represent less than 10% of the gut microbes that are in an adult gut. And so what we really need to do in the future is actually to look at what are the adult microbes, what are they doing, and how do we use those and introduce them into our diets and into our intestinal system to try and maintain health. And it may come down to a personalisation. There could be specific differences, but there could be broad differences that we can address. So there's a number of things that we need to do as we move forward.
I guess there's around the whole diet space. So we don't. Some people would take supplements and probiotics and prebiotics. But what about what are we doing in the diet space? Are we suggesting that we should be taking diverse diets or going on a vegan diet or a gluten diet. There's a lot of diets out there at the moment. So are they been proven to be beneficial for the microbes, or what? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I guess I could get in trouble by discussing the various diets that have been put forward over time. I mean, we do sort of suggest a balanced diet. I think there's a lot of evidence that different microbes respond to different nutrients. When it comes to the large bowel, where most of the microbes are present, they respond most strongly to components that are in plants. And so, in fact, most of the microbes or capabilities that are present in the human gut, they're there because there's a need to break down so many different types of microbes. So certainly having a strong dietary fibre element to your diet is important, but we do certainly recognise proteins and fats do have their role to play. Some of those can reach the large bowel, and they certainly have their role as well. In terms of, so prebiotics and probiotics, I think, we certainly recognise the need to increase the types of prebiotics that we're looking. Again, people have tended to focus on what we call fructooligosaccharides, so what's called inulin is a key ingredient in a lot of foods. That's rapidly fermented, and a lot of people respond poorly to that. So I think as we go forward, we're recognising that, as I said, there's so many different plant sources of fibres and things that can influence our gut health. If we can also start to use, for example, many waste products are rich sources of different fibres, we'll start to create new food products that are going to influence gut health that way. I think there's a real value going forward as we develop those products.
Yeah, maybe just a comment on this, going back to the soil. There's obviously there's three approaches really. There's a prebiotic approach to feed the existing ecology in the soil. There's probiotics, which we've been using probiotics for a long time in agriculture. Things like nitrogen-fixing bacteria can be added to the system to boost the amount of available nitrogen. And there's also postbiotics, which are just the metabolites from bacteria which you can harvest and use, which have really positive effects on the whole ecology. And just to comment on the gut and the root system are very, very similar. So when we do our seminars to farmers, we'll show pictures of how the gut works and how the soil root, the plant root system works. Very similar. They're just trying to extract nutrients from their environment. So there's a lot of parallels between the gut and the root systems in a plant.
It's probably similar with the ruminants as well, the livestock. So their gut, morphology and physiology are very similar. So
it is very similar, and it tells us a lot of information as well when we've got really good balance and microbial diversity, because it supports the health and immunity of the animal and the productive performance, which would be the same in the soil space for growing crops, plants. And we know that already in the human space, how the microbes have an important function with health, immunity, and even brain health. So it's all the same. It's all an integrated same system.
Yeah. So I think it's very important to note that point. So I think it's different ecosystem, but they're very similar in terms of their function in that way. So I think you mentioned, Michael, that what is a healthy microbiome, and it posed the question to you guys as well. Is that being fully characterised at the moment, both in human, animal, and soil? What is the good balance that you need to have? Or
I guess in the ruminant space where we're focused, we have a diversity of microbe population based on the feed substrate that the animal's on. So it's a very different microbiome when an animal is grazing on grass as opposed to when it's in a feedlot or ingesting grains. And we know the diversity within the rumen will change when an animal's transitioned onto a different diet. And part of the work that we're focused on is transitioning faster, and by doing that we can actually start to manipulate the populations within the rumen so they're able to actually digest the different feed that the animal is consuming. There's two aspects to that. We can do that with just diet and supplementation and more in kind of focusing on that prebiotic step. So feeding the particular microbes where we want the population to grow, or we can start introducing those particular bacteria, which is in this probiotic space, or direct fed microbials, which is, it's getting a lot of traction in livestock production. There are challenges with that. Bacteria that exist in the rumen, you know, they like, it's moist, it's a set temperature, and there's no oxygen. So these are anaerobic type bacteria. Our biggest challenge we have is actually being able to manufacture kind of the bacteria and store, like stabilise them, package, to be then able to be fed to an animal. And it's a real challenge. And part of the work that ProAgni does is actually collaborate with a lot of institutions, so CSIRO included, to take skills from different researchers, different institutions, to try and take a really great option through to a product that a producer can then use to increase their productivity and performance and lower their effect on the environment.
Yeah, for the soil, looking at the soil, if you're a farmer and you want to look at your soil microbiome, how it's functioning, that's a readily available service now, although there's not many laboratories who do it. So for about $300, you send away a soil sample and it'll give you a full spectrum of the bacteria, mainly the bacteria and fungal groups that are living in the soil, and whether they're actually in balance. So it's based on the latest science. There's also a lot of unknowns, but it gives the farmer a good idea if he's actually getting something back from if the biology is functioning, you're getting so many benefits as a farmer, and you can see whether you're tapping into those benefits or you're shutting them down with potentially too many chemical inputs on top.
Can I just add? Sorry, I just want to add one thing. In the animal, within the rumen, is the pH is a really important thing that we focus on. The optimum pH in a rumen is around 6, so it's kind of a neutral environment. That's something that we test, so within the diets. When it drops down to under kind of 5.5, you end up getting like this subacute lactic acidosis. And it's where, you know, the gut starts to get affected in the animal, and you start to see conditions in the animal such as lameness, and, you know, they end up with chronic health problems. There are a lot of animals that are affected by lactic acidosis, and it's really this imbalance of the microbe population within the gut that is actually causing that and dropping the pH down. It's a significant problem.
Yeah, so when it comes to the human, I think there's a lot of work happening which is now leading us to roughly know what probably looks like a healthy set of microbes for our gut. However, we're not there yet. We still don't have the right tools to be able to actually, fully understand function, as I mentioned before, but also to be able to measure gut health. So one of the key questions we've discussed amongst the scientists in recent times is what is health representative of just the absence of disease? Or if we knew that we've got a profile of microbes which is associated with conditions, you haven't got those symptoms yet, but perhaps in 10 to 20 years' time, you're perhaps going to develop inflammatory bowel disease or colorectal cancer. Do we take that as being an unhealthy gut microbiota, and should we be seeking to try and shift that profile? And there are a number of companies setting up in Australia, for example, where you can go and get your gut microbiota tested, and they can give you an idea of whether there is perhaps a potential risk of certain conditions, and they might make some recommendations about certain foods or other dietary lifestyle changes that you might want to make to perhaps shift your profile to something that might be regarded as healthy. But I think we're still a long way off in being able to clearly say what actually represents a healthy microbiome in humans. Yeah.
Thanks. So, John mentioned before, we've got, especially in humans, we've got trillions of bacteria, more bacteria than cells. So are we, at the moment, in all three different spaces, are we able to characterize all those bacteria that's living in soil, in animals, and in humans? Are we discovering new bacteria at all? Can you guys comment on that?
Yeah, look, it's such an evolving space, the microbiome, that I speak to some professors who say we know about 1%. and some will say 5%, but we're certainly down at that level, but it's a massive exponential learning curve at the moment, so there's new information coming out all the time. So I think in the soils we know the major groups, and we know good functionality. We can measure the enzyme reactions that are coming from the bacterial groups and fungal groups and vitamins that are produced by bacteria. So there's so many positives that we can measure today, but aside from that, there's a lot of unknowns as well.
From our experience, it's the same. So it's a low percentage. I think in the animal space, animals have such a short life cycle, really. But there is a lot of research being done at a lot of institutions. Again, we know kind of the major groups of different bacterial species, and again, what their byproducts are, what kind of energy they provide to animals. But I think I said earlier too, these bacteria adapt and change and modify really rapidly, can be in a matter of minutes if they're under a selective pressure. So, it'll be an evolving space, but it's very, very exciting.
So in the human space, yeah, there's definitely a lot of new species being found quite regularly. So I think the human microbiome projects that sort of happened about 10 years ago, they tend to focus on Europeans. And what we know of sort of a number of projects, for example, in Asia, where they're finding a lot of species that weren't picked up in some of those other studies. So yeah, different geographic regions, different dietary habits have sort of led to different microbes, and so yeah, we're still finding out what they are.
Yeah, you raise a really good point there. So in terms of geographic location and also ethnicity, would have different diversity of bacteria. So you mentioned before, one, you might have a good microbiome, might not be the same for another person. So yeah, can you guys comment in terms of location and I guess different species in terms of livestock, cows and sheep, and that have different.
Yep. We do know that there are different microbes in particular species, but we also know there's beneficial ones that are across species. So there's a particular bacteria that we work with that it's present in cattle, sheep, pigs, chicken. It's actually a lactic utilising microbe, and a similar space for starch utilising microbes. As far as different locations, it probably more comes down to different feed substrates. So we do know that particular species are not present within the rumen when an animal is on a grass-based diet. But yet, as soon as they're introduced to any form of grain, that particular species will start to grow and then become the predominant species within the rumen. And it's because their function is to metabolise the lactate. So I guess that's what we see in the animal space. We're focused on a small space, so I couldn't comment on the broader aspect of all animals.
Yeah, I think with the soils, there's a lot of similarities across the world. I think if you look back at evolution, so when plants first came out of the ocean and colonized the land, they did that in association with a fungus, so a mycorrhizal fungi, which is called root fungus. And if you speak to specialists in mycorrhizal fungi, they'll say that the job of a farmer is just not to destroy that relationship between the plant and the fungus. It's so important for growing healthy crops, because the mycorrhizal fungi extend out the root zone massively, and they communicate through the soil. They're like the internet of the soil across great distances. It can be a kilometre. It can be picking up nutrients from the next field, the next farmer, and bringing it back to the plant. So the foundations of what we're looking at in the microbiome are probably quite similar across the globe, but then there's going to be site-specific issues. We're part of something called the European Microbiome Support Group, which is it's part of the Euro 2020 Horizon program. So it's serious funding in Europe for the microbiome, and that's looking with industry and universities about how does this get regulated? How do you develop different microbial species? How do you transfer them around the world? What are biosecurity issues, etc.? So there's a lot of learning.
There's probably not a lot more I can add from what I'd said before, but there's definitely dietary and geographic differences in the human gut microbiota. I mean, one of the interesting points, though, is to what extent can you shift the microbiota? Certainly, just as people here, if they suddenly moved to another country and started eating a different type of food, you will probably see a shift in your gut microbiota, but to a certain extent. The big shift that you see in the geographic regions is probably from generational or long-term changes where there's some genetic interactions going on there. And we certainly know you can see big shifts in the microbiome if there's some significant event that some disease or taking of antibiotics, for example. But yeah, so there is a level of shift that can occur with geography in humans.
Well, it's been a great discussion already, so we can continue this on for like hours. But I just want to pose one final question to the panelists, which is the question of the session. So is the microbiome the solution to all of our problems? Can you, in your space, what do you think? If it's there, if it's not there, and if it's not there, what should we be doing to make that a possibility?
Yeah, okay. So if I can just talk at a global level, so if we think about the grand challenges that we're facing now, and some of them are extremely urgent, so climate security, food security, biodiversity loss, and I would add chronic human health problems. So if you look at those 4 issues, they all need to be tackled with great urgency, probably inside the next 10 years. And I think the microbiome is going to be a big part of the solution. I would think at least, if I had to put a percentage, say at least 50% of the solutions to all of those major issues are going to come from the microbiome. I don't think you can have resilient farming without having a lively microbiome that's contributing to the health of the system. And your vineyards will fall over without that biological protection. Certainly monoculture cropping won't be able to adapt to climate change. And I think from a human health point of view, you're just not getting the trace elements. The trace elements that give us health are just declining in all our food sources, about 50% down from 60, 70 years ago. So without the microbiome functioning that actually picks up these nutrients from the soil, like the mycorrhizal fungi, we're damaging our human health. So I don't think we can't meet these core challenges. And biodiversity, you can't have, if you go on a broadacre farm using a lot of chemicals and hear the silence, there's something wrong, you should be able to hear the birds and the bees, but you can't. It's a lot of silence out there. It's a bit scary. But I think the microbiome is giving us a lot of answers, so it's going to be a big part of the solution.
I agree, obviously. And it's an exciting space to be involved in the microbiome, the research and the adoption of microbiome technology, especially in the animal production where we're focused. Personally, I've had a lot of exposure in the human space. I've got a keen interest in the human microbiome as well. And I think overall, it comes from the soil, the soil microbiome diversity comes through to our plants. The plants then replenish us or also the livestock. So, it's coming through the food supply chain. If we can improve the microbiome at all levels, then we will create far more nutritious food that are delivering far more health, performance outcomes that we're not seeing probably today. And we can turn back the clock on some of the damage that we've already done to our environment to create, a resilient agri and food industry going forward globally. This is a global challenge that we're facing. It's not just within our shores. The other aspect of having a diversity in the microbiome and a really healthy microbiome is the efficiency that's created from that. So we start to utilise the resources with far more efficiently. The bacteria are just amazing at how they can take, something from a blade of grass and convert it to a kilo kind of meat. And when you get that balance right, we can really change the economics as well for the industry.
Certainly it seems as though in humans that the gut microbiome, obviously we've got a skin microbiome and the bugs are everywhere. Well, certainly not necessarily in all tissues, but certainly the impacts of your gut microbes can be felt in most tissues. So we know there's hundreds of different species producing, perhaps millions of different molecules which can get into the bloodstream and have impacts far away, whether it's the brain or whether it's the lungs or whether it's your skin. Certainly, the gut-brain axis is also playing a massive, or potentially a massive role in our lives. Well, certainly, I think it's obviously not the be-all and end-all of health and our lives, but I think the gut microbes are playing such a pivotal role. We do need to take care of them.
Okay, thanks, panel. So I might open, some Q&A at the moment. So please come up to the microphone if you've got a question to ask to our, diverse panelists. In whichever you like to, just come to the microphone. Anyone?
Is this on? All right. So given that there's still so little that we know about the microbiome, whether in soil or in human or animals, what role do you see AI and big data playing in this space, or is there already things going on there that will help us speed up and catch up to this ever-changing biome?
I can just, absolutely. I mean, as a scientist, I know one of our biggest challenges we carry out what's called sequencing, which is sort of a technique to try and make sense of, all the microbes that are present in the gut. So it's a molecular technique, and to understand that data, you've got to have bioinformatics. And as we try to understand the genes and what they're producing, all that massive amount of data has got to be assimilated in some way. And so, yes, definitely, I know in CSIRO and other places, sort of e-health or AI are going to be touted as playing a big role over the next 5 to 10 years to try and understand and pull out, key facts in all of that data.
Yeah, look, it's incredible what's going on in that space. So just in one company in Shenzhen in China, their DNA sequencing everything that lives in the soil, every living bacteria, fungi, everything. And obviously what they're heading for is algorithms. So when you can fly over a paddock now, and the algorithms are mostly based on chemical nutrition. So they're not incorporating all the biological data underneath in the soil. So the accuracy is probably not as good as it could be. But if you incorporate all the biological data, it is possible that you could fly over a paddock and understand the chemistry and the biology and the physical aspects of the farm. And you can use AI in the future with algorithms that really work.
And I'd just like to add, I think with the sequencing, and Dr. Shapiro touched on it yesterday, like there's opportunities with the gene editing. So if we know that there's particular species of microbe, there's opportunities for modification of the microbiome through the work that's been done there. The other thing is the sharing of information between all of our research institutions and the collaboration, really, because so many universities across the globe have so much content and information, and to be able to cross-share that, release restrictions on IP, we can move a lot faster in this space.
Question over there.
Cool, thank you. This question is actually prompted by a social media push from the Fermentation Association in the US this morning, so that it's timely. And it aims at human nutrition, but obviously it's going to be broader than that. And the discussion was about the relative benefits of humans taking out probiotic tablets as opposed to eating, fermented foods, and what's better for you. So, yes, human, but of course, yes, animals, and I guess, yes, soils. So, interested.
Well, yeah, I mean, personally, I think generally we agree that taking prebiotics is probably the better option because you're feeding the existing set of microbes that are present. A probiotic or set of probiotics is only going to deliver those specific microbes, whereas if you've got hundreds of different microbes that are feeding off all those different food components in your diet, it makes sense to feed all of those microbes together. I guess the problem is that if you are deficient in a type of microbe or microbial function, there's a place perhaps for trying to modulate your microbes in some way, and whether it's through a probiotic and or through something like a fecal transplantation, which is another completely different subject. So I think there's a place for all of the different treatments, and I think we'll see all of those different treatments having different roles in the future.
Just to add to that, one of the challenges too with the probiotic supplementation is the delivery to the site that it's needed. So in humans, it's getting it to kind of the hindgut and the intestine where you want to absorb that bacteria. And there's been challenges in the human space in actually getting bacteria through the acid environment of the stomach. Now in the ruminants, it's the reverse. So it's the foregut, the rumen, where there's, the pH is 6. So we don't have to worry about trying to get our probiotics through the acid environment of the stomach that we see in monogastric animals and also the humans. So there's a lot of work being done in trying to microencapsulate and stabilise bacteria to get it to the area of the digestive system where it will be of greatest use.
Can I just add to that? Just one of the reasons probiotics has probably got bad press is one of the points I raised earlier, is that we're focusing on those very few microbes that have come from fermented foods, from fermented milk, and we do really need to push towards getting some of those more adult microbes used as probiotics.
Yeah. Another question there?
I've got a story on Landline this Sunday with regenerative farmers, and one of them says that she stopped drenching her sheep. They stopped feeding their sheep grain because they wanted the makeup in the gut to change, because what they excreted would then help them improve their soil, and they're in really crappy country and they're rebuilding it, making it more, putting more carbon in the soil. So what is the relationship that they're relying on there? And so it's a soil question and an animal health question. And is it like only 1 or 2% of farmers are listening to this sort of conversation at the moment?
It is a small percent of farmers. I guess the issue with grain feeding livestock is that they are fed antibiotics to control kind of the lactic acidosis created from the grain. Now, when those antibiotics are not therapeutic doses, they're subtherapeutic doses. So you actually get this kind of a resistant bacteria environment created. It's coming out the back end of animals, and then obviously affecting soils and the environment. I was at the Carbon Conference and involved in the regenerative ag. So it is really about eliminating kind of the toxic components that we've started to introduce into industrialised farming, and seeing how we still can get the performance that you do get from using those compounds, but doing it more naturally. So focused on prebiotic, adjusting diets, and kind of feeding the bugs so they can create the byproducts that we're looking for. I couldn't comment on the no drenching.
Yeah, look, I'd just say in agriculture, right from the seed treatments, the soil treatments, like farmers will just routinely put fungicides on the seed, and you ask them why. Well, we've been doing it for years, But if you actually put nutrition on the seed, you get a better outcome. But some of these things have just been happening in ag for so long because of the fear of a disease that they haven't tried so much nutritional treatments, and it's the same for pasture. If you treat the pasture well with good healthy products that are driving the soil function, then the sheep will all go and feed on that section of the paddock. They won't touch the other areas. But if you're putting glyphosate out, which is an antibiotic really, then you're causing problems for your sheep and your cattle and your crops. So there's a compromise there with some of the chemical inputs. And I think a lot of it's just been done routinely, and you've got to transition slowly in agriculture. You can't get a farmer to change abruptly. So it's a gentle switch to sort of less chemically intensive. So I think it's got to be done gradually. But I think some of it's just happening because that's what we've always done. Organic farmers don't drench.
Thinking about the drench, we'd get an imbalance between the parasite load, the bacterial load within the rumen. So, yeah.
Question there?
I'd like to pick up on the conversation around prebiotics in humans particularly. So question for Michael. You mentioned perhaps less interest in inulin as a very fast to ferment prebiotic, and that there are potential waste fibres from other plants. I wonder if you could pick up on that and just give some specific examples.
Yeah, so for example, some of the work I've been doing with various companies and independently, So, for example, we're looking at marine sources. We're trying to develop more of a marine industry here in Australia. We've got such a massive resource in some of the brown seaweeds, for example, that around our coasts, and we've been working with universities, particularly Flinders University, at isolating different components from brown seaweeds. So they've got prebiotic components, they've got other components that we found have beneficial effects on the gut microbes. There are other waste streams that we've looked at, both from massive international companies that have a massive amount of waste, where we can demonstrate that there are gut beneficial products in most of those things. So I think whatever perhaps organic sort of waste, or not even just waste, but other foods or potential foods, if they've got a significant amount of polysaccharides in them, they've potentially got prebiotic potential. And so we're only just looking at the tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding what they could do.
Are you not allowed to mention what that multinational...
I wouldn't. It's quite a controversial... but it's beneficial in the sense that this particular product that they're extracting from this plant, they recognise that there's a lot of waste, and why not get added benefit from this byproduct?
We might have to wrap it up there. So I think it's been a great conversation. So I might just summarise in terms of the question for the whole, I guess for the panellists is the microbiome the solution for all problems. So I think there's huge potential there for the microbiome to do that. So that I think that's the take-home message that I would provide. So I'm not sure if the panellists have anything to add to that.
I'd only add just to have an awareness and be aware of the microbiome in your production systems and how you might be able to modify your practices to enhance that microbiome, because you will benefit economically, environmentally, and also socially.
Yeah, I just want to say for your microbiomes, the things that you can do, you obviously change your diet with a high fibre diet, avoid chemical loading, antibiotics in your system, and be in nature. One of the key messages is be in nature. Take your shoes off and your socks, get in the dirt, get your feet dirty. If you don't do that, you don't get exposed to microbial. That's what kids are not getting that with their iPads now. They need to get in the garden, get in dirt. It's good for you.
And have a diverse diet. I think that's the key for Michael.
Well, I might finish off there. So just can you put your hands together for great panellists? So thanks, John, Fiona, and Michael. So thank you for attending. So hope you learned a lot. So I certainly did. Thank you.